Yate Shikedo Shidena Shay Ya Roderick Begaincha Aroden Slinige Ya Twidik Ojanasla Being Betot A Bushes Chin Kia Ana Etos Shay Dos Sitna Genie Dashanelle Aro Telana Ea de Nasha. Today's PowerPoint, I have prepared a PowerPoint today on chapter budgets and fund management plans. And before we get into that, I just wanted to remind everyone that the Navajo Department of Justice does have a public education webpage. There's the link where you can find it. Back in October, I did a Navajo Chapters 101. And then last week, we did one for the recent proposed amendment to the Local Governance Act. For the month of February, we decided to do a chapter series. So this week, talking about chapter budgets and fundamental management plans. Next week, tentatively, reasons why we need to amend the LGA, and then at the end of the month, hopefully, I can talk about the four possible models of proposed amendments to the LGA. And so, moving on to today's topic, I thought about, what would be a good idea to talk about for the second week. And over my tenure here at DOJ, dealing with a lot of chapter turmoil at the chapter level, whether it's a dispute, amongst the chapter officials or chapter officials and the employees, or even involving the community members. In all of those disputes, one common denominator is the chapter budget, and there's a lot of misconceptions about what chapters can do in terms of spending and what they can't do. And so hopefully this presentation will provide the public with the knowledge. Also, another good reason for having this presentation today is that we're going to be entering a new budget cycle for fiscal year 25. And so covering some of the chapter budget process, I felt like it would be a good thing to cover. And so a lot of some of the slides that I have might not be as viewable, but here are some of the online resources where I'm getting these materials, and you can download these materials for yourself. And so one of them is the DIBS website. And so I have the link there, and you could search for various council actions, committee actions, primarily all legislations that enter the legislative process. And for purposes of today, the comprehensive budget that was passed by Navajo Nation Council for fiscal year 2024, Navajo Nation Council Resolution CS-78-23. You can find that there. And then if you go to the Office of Management and Budget website, under the Laws and Regulations tab, there's some information there that might be helpful. They're also on the Download tab under the Dropbox for Navajo Nation funds. You can download the Budget Instructions Manual. And that's important because Appendix M has the chapter budget procedures. Appendix M-1 has the chapter budget policies. And so those are going to be helpful, I believe, to gain further understanding about the chapter budgeting process and what chapters can spend on and can't spend on. And finally, we're going to end the presentation, or towards the end of the presentation, talk about the Division of Community Development website and some helpful resources. And we'll take a look at that. And then under the archives tab, just a reminder that you can download the latest copy of the Local Governance Act. And so it's current as of today, the one that you can download from DCD's website. So now moving on to, let's start with the kind of boring stuff. Some of the laws that we have, very general. In the Appropriations Act, Title 12, we have the 50-50 formula. Basically, this law says generally, most times when you're appropriating to giving money to chapters, appropriating, then there's going to be the first half is going to be divided equally. So, and then the second half of the funds is going to be distributed according to the voter registration number. And so that's what they talk a lot about, the 50-50 formula. And typically, depending on the funding, this law is usually waived, especially during the comprehensive budgeting process. And we'll talk about reasons why that is. And then also the law that I'm quoting here at Section 820, letter O. This is the most updated one. So if you look at the any versions of the code, it might not have all of the language here, but this slide has that language. Under 820N basically describes that chapter funds, when chapters get funding every year, it doesn't lapse. It doesn't come back to Window Rock at the end of the year. And when I say end of the year, we're talking about September 30th every year. So our fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th every year. So if you haven't spent your money by September 30th, then it all comes back to Window Rock. It comes back to the same pot, but not for chapters. So chapters have a lot of carryover budgets that they also address as part of their annual budgeting process. So another relatively general law is in Title 26, the Local Governance Act. And, generally talks about the preparation of the budget, the consultations that is needed between the chapter manager or the community service coordinator. So manager, CSC, they're used interchangeably because the managers are usually at LGA certified chapters. CSCs are at non-LGA certified chapters. But those persons, they consult with the chapter officials, and they prepare the budget and they present it to the community. And then one of the, couple of key provisions here, chapters can't spend more than they have budgeted. That's a law. And they also can't make payments, or they can't obligate it. So, they can't enter into a contract when they don't have a budget for that expenditure. So all of that has to be done by community approval. That's in Section 2001 of the LGA, that, some of these expenditures require community approval as well, especially contracts. And the dimension here in part one here, talking about the budget, annual budget instructions manual. What does that say? And here we'll have the slide here talking about Section 10A of you know, the fiscal year 2024 budget instructions manual. And if most of the provisions usually get carried over year to year. But last year's uh, manual actually had several amendments. So if you compare FY23 to FY24, there are some significant amendments there. So, you might want to download and take a look at those two. But here, it first, this is one of the areas when it talks about the chapter win system. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But chapters are supposed to use this win system to prepare and submit their budgets to the Administrative Service Centers, ASCs. And ASC is a department within the Division of Community Development, DCD. So apologize if I overuse acronyms, but that's what they stand for, ASC and DCD. And so this manual instructs chapters to use the budget forms, and also talks about object codes, that there needs to be a chapter resolution prior to entering the chapter budget into the FMIS. And so some of you might think, what are we talking about here? What are object codes? What is the FMIS? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, that'll start to make sense and become more clear. But essentially, there are two different accounting systems. And at the Window Rock level, we have the controller's office primarily using the FMIS, the Financial Management Information System, whereas chapters enter data into the woven integrated Navajo data. So WIN system, that's what it stands for. So, you have different chapter fund accounts. And there are several fund accounts. We are going to cover this in upcoming slides. So if I'm going too fast, we are going to cover that. And so, especially with the information that we're talking about, accounting systems, software, and the fact that each chapter has their own bank account, and these bank accounts are not set up in terms of object codes or fund accounts. These systems are not integrated in a sense that one system talks with another. So that is the reason why the controller's office can't see what chapters are doing in terms of their checking accounts, unless and until that information is uploaded into the WIN system. So that's just for your information. We're going to be talking about, again, fund accounts in section 4 of Appendix M-1. That'll be in slide 14 upcoming. And so because they don't talk to one another, and because Window Rock can't see what chapters are doing, that's partially the reason why we have ASCs, Administrative Service Centers. And so ASCs help monitor those chapter expenditures to make sure that chapters are expending in accordance with the different policies. So let's see. Okay, so I got some comments. No questions yet. So let's move forward and talk. These next few slides are copies of what I've, uh, I guess, downloaded and just for your view. Again, you should be able to download these policies for your own. It can be found on OMB's website, on the same website that I mentioned on slide number 3. And so these next 3 slides come from the budget instructions manual. So if you scroll all the way down, you'll eventually get to Appendix M. And Appendix M is the chapter budget procedures. And this provides a more detailed outline of what the annual budgetary process is. What is the role of the chapter officials when they're preparing their annual budgets? What is the role of the chapter manager slash community service coordinator? And then what is the role of the administrative assistant slash account maintenance specialist? And how did they all interrelate and prepare the budget to be submitted to the ASCs? So again, this is where it's repeated that chapters submit their budgets through the WIN system, basically. And here's the next page. And what I wanted to highlight from this page is subsection F, which describes that once the chapter has approved their budget and it's entered into the WIN system, and this assumes that council and the president approve the comprehensive budget, then the controller's office will issue a check or electronically transfer the chapter budget amount. So, so that's how chapters. And initially, when the LGA was first adopted in 1998, this was not the process. Chapters received their budgets on a quarterly basis, and so I'm not sure what year it changed where chapters received their full budgets in October. But again, this is just for your information. And then section 2 talks about gives a chart outlining the same process described above in section 1. So, and then we want to talk about on this third page of the Appendix M, section 6. I'm sorry. What I meant to say is, this covers the remaining chart, but what I wanted to add is that the chapter, there is another template out there. It's called the 5 management system. And there are 5 FMS for short, for personnel, procurement, property, records management, and fiscal. So your fiscal policies at the chapter level, most of the 110 chapters are required to follow some fiscal policies as well. And so in those fiscal policies, there's section 6 that also talks about the chapter operating budget. And so if you look at that template, that also describes the requirement of having a chapter resolution, and that chapters cannot start spending until the chapter approves that budget. And so sometimes, you will hear that chapters are in turmoil, don't agree with the budget, have not passed a resolution to approve the budget. And so there's, chapters at a standstill because they can't spend until they, pass a resolution. If they're not passing a resolution, that means they can't start spending money. So, these are the policies addressing, that there is a requirement that chapters have to pass a resolution to start spending. Also, in the fiscal policies, if you look at subsection C, it talks about the budget preparation and process. And also, section 7 talks about the internal control policies and procedures. And earlier I talked about the WIN system and how it doesn't really show up in the chapter's bank account, itemized or segregated. And so, every month, chapters need to reconcile all of their fund accounts to make sure that at the end of the month, everything, dollar for dollar, penny for penny, that it matches up at the end of the month. And so bank reconciliation procedures, what those are in the fiscal policies. So let me stop there to see if there are any questions. Can the chapter pass a resolution to adjust the stipend amounts that go to the officials? Not necessarily the amount. Under the LGA, you have a provision saying that, 500 per meeting, in accordance with the chapter or the approved budget. So every year, council passes a resolution, and in that resolution says 12 planning meetings, 12 regular meetings, at 500 per official. And so the presumption is one planning meeting, one regular meeting per month. However, having said that, that's for the fiscal year budget. So remember earlier I talked about carryover budgets. If your chapter has a carryover budget, in your stipend account, then that could potentially be used for quote unquote extra meetings. So some of those extra meetings could be emergency meetings, special chapter meetings, and so forth. So not necessarily an increase, so to speak, but also interestingly, probably that under the LGA, if you pass an ordinance to compensate your chapter officials, that could potentially, have an effect on, how chapters process payments or compensate their chapter officials. So that's going into a little bit more detail, or some things that hopefully I didn't confuse anyone about, but but basically, just to answer the question, if you were to compensate your chapter official and the people in your community approve that by ordinance, potentially that can happen. But that's only an option for LGA or governance certified chapters, not for non-LGA certified chapters. Okay, so I think that's the only, most of the things I'm seeing are comments. And there's another comment about budget summaries, but I have a slide for that. So let's move along so we can get to that slide. All right. So next, I want to talk about Appendix M-1. Again, also in the budget instructions manual that you can download. And this, you'll see page 95 of the budget instructions manual. You'll find Appendix M-1. And so what's the basic difference, between Appendix M and Appendix M-1 is M says, when you're preparing your annual budget, here's the process. Here are those budget procedures. And then for the most part, M-1 sets forth the chapter budget policies. So here's what the funds are at the chapter level. Here are the authorized expenditures. Here are the disallowed expenditures. So those are the, basically two main differences between the two documents. And where there is no fund management plan for a particular chapter fund, Section 2A requires chapters to develop a fund management plan. And chapters aren't companies. We are government. Chapters are a part of the Navajo Nation government. There is a requirement of showing the people how the funds were spent. So a lot of requirement of transparency. I say that because, sometimes there's a sense that, oh, chapter has money. Why can't we spend for this? And chapter, we elected you there, just make it happen. That's not how it works. It is a government, and so there are set budgets, and so so under Section 2C, it does talk about chapter budget changes, and this is how, if you had if you didn't have enough funds in one area, you could potentially move some funds. And the key word is potentially, because a lot of the chapter fund accounts are restricted funds. So a lot of times you can't put, one pot of money into another pot in order to accomplish something, because a lot of these funds are restricted. And so I have another slide talking about that to give you an example. But that provision also says when it's proper, when chapters can do that, then that budget transfer requires a chapter resolution. So the people have to agree to that budget transfer when it's allowed. Okay. All right. So here I talked about, under slide number 7, in an earlier slide, I talked about the WIN system and chapter fund accounts. Here, beginning with Section 4, we have Appendix M-1 identifying most of the chapter fund accounts. It doesn't have all of them. So For example, some of the Utah chapters receive funding from the state of Utah. So that's not in here. So that's what I mean by most of the chapter fund accounts. But universally, all of the 110 chapters, for the most part, have the fund accounts listed in Section 4. And also, just to make note that some of the chapter budget policies that are in Appendix M-1, a few years ago, what we did was just copy word for word what the chapter budget fund management plans are, from whether it's a budget and finance committee resolution or an old TCDC resolution or RDC resolution. We copied it word for word, so that was mostly in one place. So that we did a few years ago. And then importantly, some fund accounts don't have a fund management policy. And it's up to the chapter to create those fund management policies. And so an example of that is Fund 1, the chapter activities general fund. Usually, chapters do not have a fund management plan specifying what those funds can be used for, what they can't be used for. But they really ought to have the community input as to what allowable and disallowable expenditures are. Because if you don't do that, that invites conflict. We shouldn't have used it for that. And there's just a lot of conflict that arises. But if you have a fund management plan that describes, hey, this is what this fund should be used for, or and something saying, oh, we can use this fund account to supplement a different fund account, that would be ideal. That way, it lessens the dispute. Otherwise, you're just inviting conflict, because the community doesn't know what you're using the Fund 01 account funds, what they're being used for. And so that's an example of that. And then my another example of I talked about restrictions and restricted fund accounts. You look at here the Chapter Claims Trust Fund, Fund 03, and you see that there's a purpose, and their purpose is discussed in Title 12 of the Navajo Nation Code. And so these funds have certain expenditures that are allowable and disallowable. And so that's what I'm getting at is, even though a chapter might have a high balance here, there are intended purposes for use of those funds. So moving on to this. Next slide is I wanted to talk specifically about Fund 9, which is the Housing Discretionary Fund. There is an old Transportation and Community Development Committee, TCDC, resolution creating a template saying that chapters, if you don't have a template, here's the procedures on how your community can spend those funds, and here's a template expressing, what the chapter's duties are. And so, but by saying that, it's inviting chapters to create their own policies. So I didn't feel like inserting the entire housing discretionary um, fund management plan here, because there's a lot of chapters that have submitted their own or created their own housing discretionary fund policy. They sometimes, usually they'll send it to DOJ, not always. We review it for legal sufficiency, and we send it back to chapters that request for DOJ review. But just the idea that uh, each chapter might have their own housing discretionary fund policy. Um, when a fund policy is reviewed by DOJ and it's presented to the at a chapter meeting and approved by the community by chapter resolution, it becomes a public document. So the Navajo public, it becomes a public record. So everyone in your community should be able to go to your local chapters and say, "Hey, I want to see a copy of what our housing discretionary fund policy looks like." And you can easily also ask, whether it's me at DOJ or for a copy of the old 2001 TCDC policy. Match that up and see what the differences are. That you could do. But again, the point being that each chapter might have a different housing discretionary fund policy. And the same holds true for summer youth employment policy and your public employment policy, program. So PEP workers, those have templates approved by the old TCDC, but all three of those templates say chapters, you may adopt your own or create your own policy for those things. So let's see, let's move on to this slide and talk about the Section K. Is mostly, again, I talked about this earlier, mostly a copy paste of the fund management plan of the sales tax revenue management plan. And this, that was passed by the Budget and Finance Committee. It's been amended. The last time it was amended, it was in 2017. And so, having said that, last year's Appendix M-1 was amended. And so some of these provisions might not match up to the Budget and Finance Committee resolution. So you might want to, in my mind, the Budget and Finance Committee resolution is supreme over what's written in Section K. And so just for your information, so I would, if I were you as a member of the public, look up that BFMY-19-17 to see the most legit version of the fund management policy for the sales tax. Also, the sales tax revenue fund is another good example of it being a restricted fund. So there are three general purposes: infrastructure, economic development, and other government purposes. And so sometimes these are applied liberally in its application. Sometimes it's narrowly applied. So, so it's helpful to have a listing of what the allowable uses are and what are the prohibited uses. The unhealthy food and beverage tax fund is also another one of those funds. That is a restricted fund. You can't use these funds in order to move over to, help with a housing discretionary project, for example. It just, even if you pass it by chapter resolution, even if your whole community agreed to it, the purpose of these funds, and what they're meant for, they have a specific purpose. So despite what the chapter wants, here are the fund policies for certain fund accounts. Here's what it says, for the remainder of the unhealthy tax provisions. And then here, talking about performance budgeting, the forms that need to be submitted, and then the chapter reporting of the funds, to the ASC, and so and also to the community. There is a law in the LGA that talks about those monthly financial reports and how they need to be reported, and we'll cover that in a later slide. Okay, let me see. This is a good opportunity to see if there's any more questions. Is the budget manual like a USFR? I'm not familiar with that acronym, so if you could spell that out, I would appreciate it. Have virtual chapter meetings been approved? Not yet, to my understanding. So again, that was the presentation last week. You need a 56 chapter resolution. And then housing discretionary. Where do we look for more information? It would be, again, you could email me. I can send you a copy of the template, but I would, for your chapter, go to your local chapter, see what their policies say. If there's do they follow the old TCDC template? Do they not? Do they have their own? That's where I would probably start first. Make it more exciting. It's a dry topic. And so, sorry, I'm not a good entertainer. So, all right, enough of that. All right, let's move on to talk about the latest comprehensive budget for fiscal year 2024. Again, this is Navajo Nation Council Resolution CS-78-23. And we're strictly talking about the general fund allocation and also the special revenue allocations. And on slide 3 is where you can go to the Navajo DIBS website to get a copy of the comprehensive budget resolution. And as I understand it, what you will find in that budget resolution, and you scroll all the way down to the chapter budgets, it doesn't include some of the other funds that chapter receive. For example, Utah chapters get funding from the state of Utah. I don't think it includes the gaming revenue fund, which is distributed, I believe, as a separate allocation. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there, but the point I'm just making is when there's a comprehensive budget, we're only talking about general fund allocations and the special revenue allocations. Okay, so when you pull that up, you'll find and discover what your chapter received back in October of 2023 and the budget that they're working with for right now. And this is just an overall allocation. And so really don't have any other comments other than to say, if you're interested and to know what your chapter received in terms of the general fund budget, and here's where to look. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But I did want to spend a little bit of time on providing some context to all of this. So let's see. If I can share my other screen. Okay, so you all should be seeing the DCD website, Division of Community Development. And this has some good information about chapter budgets. If you scroll down here and you look and you click on chapter fund balances, it'll take you to the WIN system. And so, not to pick on Black Mesa, but just because they're first on the list here, you can click on View Fund Balance. And when you do that, it'll create a PDF file. And this is what we have been talking about. All of the different fund accounts. Fund 01, General Activity Fund. This is what their balance was in October. Here's what it looks like in December. And so these get updated on a monthly basis. And this is how much they have for the remaining of their fund accounts. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to show these resources, because again, sometimes one of the common complaints is that a chapter might not be reporting their monthly financial reports on a monthly basis at every chapter meeting. They may not know what the fund balances are, and so this provides a monthly report of where the chapter stands in regards to certain fund accounts. And so you can pull up for your chapter where they are. The only downside to this is that it's reported on a monthly basis. So we don't know during the month of, from this November to December, what they spent. Why did the fund increase? Why did the fund decrease? We don't get that specific. But nevertheless, I still feel like, this is a good resource for the Navajo public to, to see that it's out there. This is another resource. If you don't know what your fund balances are at your chapter level, this would be a good resource to look to see. Obviously, we need to update it for the month of January, but at least you have something, and you can start asking questions about some of these fund balances. So that's the WIN system regarding some of those fund balances, fund accounts. Another good resources, if you look at chapter and DCD department budgets, if you click on that, it's going to take you to the WIN system again. And here's one, carryover budget. What does that look like for that healthy, unhealthy tax? So if you click on that allocation, and so it'll generate this report. And so obviously, not some are pending, some have been allocated, and so and you can do that for all of the different carryover budgets. Sales tax, what does that look like at my chapter? Black Mesa, again, it'll create this will be an Excel file. And let me see, hopefully that shows up on the screen. If it doesn't, I apologize. No, it did not, but you get the idea. You get the idea that here are some of the resources that you all can view yourself and pull this information for yourself. And this is all free. You don't need a username, password. It's all public information. And so using the DCD resources, that would be great. And arm yourself with this information. Okay. Let me stop there and see if there are any more questions. Is there a restriction on how many times an individual can be hired under PEP? No, not that I'm aware of. There's no policy restriction that I'm aware of. Essentially in 2024, chapters should be using their personnel policies, or especially local governance certified chapters. PEP employees would fall under temporary personnel. And so using the hiring procedures under your personnel file management system is what would be used. And so together, whether you look at the PEP policy or whether you look at your internal chapter file management system for personnel, you would you don't have a restriction on how many times they can be a personnel or employee. All right. Somebody's been asking for the policies and procedures from their chapter. which I would encourage you to arm yourself with the information of the Privacy Act. So the DCD website, if you go up here to the Archives tab and you click on that, it has a good amount of information. It doesn't have all the information that community members and the Navajo public should know, but it does have a copy that you can pull of the Privacy Act. Here it is. So you can download this for yourself. And the reason I say that, because if there's public information, like chapter resolutions, your chapter budgets, if there's public information like that, under the Navajo Nation Privacy Act, once you make a request, then the chapter has 90 days to respond to your request. Same with the Navajo Nation government. You go to court, ask for a record, they have 90 days to respond. You come to DOJ, you submit a records request, we have 90 days to respond to your request, either to comply with your request or to give you reasons to deny your request. And then it doesn't just stop there. You could, go to court and potentially require, whether it's the chapter or whether it's a division program, can require them to seek a court order to, have you view those records. So if in fact it's true that you've been waiting for 4 years, I would highly recommend that you download what our Navajo Nation Privacy Act says. It demonstrates what protected records are. It demonstrates what public records are. It's not completely comprehensive. It doesn't describe everything, but it gives you a good idea. It talks about the 90 days and what the Navajo government responsibilities are in terms of addressing the Navajo public's request for a public record. It also talks about protected records, but there are certain procedures for that as well. So that's what I would recommend. Arm yourself with information. Can a chapter manager hire their own family to work inside the chapter house? Now, the answer depends. There's a there's a certain process. It probably shouldn't be happening because both parties have to avoid a conflict of interest if that happens. And then also under the typical personnel policies, there is a nepotism policy. So you really want to avoid those, hiring decisions. But, having said that, could there be mechanisms put in place in order to hire a relative? Yes. The supervisor can't supervise their family members, for example. And so again, there's a duty to avoid a conflict of interest. But yeah, again, those, how do normal, supervisors, how would they know what a conflict of interest is? And, how would they avoid it? Because we're not always there to provide that guidance on that. So the best practice, is just to avoid any potential of it. And so that's how I'll address that. It's possible, but not recommended. Why are PP workers eligible for administrative leave pay? And actually, they are, again, I don't want to confuse the audience, but let's say President Nygren issues admin leave for this afternoon. He is the executive branch chief officer. And so that admin leave would apply to executive branch employees. And because the community service coordinator and AMS are technically executive branch employees, then they would be eligible for the admin leave issued by President Nygren. But that wouldn't extend to others, right? And so, for the most part, it wouldn't extend to PEP workers because PEP workers fall under the category of chapter employees. However, having said that, if the chapter is following their personnel rules, then the authorizations can be given at the local level, and chapters at the local level can see President Nygren's memo and say, okay, we'll go ahead and follow suit and do the same for our employees. So that's possible. Do chapters really do that? I'm not sure, but there is a process for some of these things. But do PEP workers, are they automatically eligible? No, in my opinion. So that's what I'll say about that. How long can PEP workers? I'm assuming the question is how long can PEP workers be allowed to work? And so that's a really good question, because under the old TCDC policies, there were, I guess, under the old policies, it presumed that there would be chapter projects, and these are short-term projects, and so it's short-term employment. And so that's what I'll say about that is it was meant for that, but a lot of chapters have, because they don't receive additional personnel funding, they have used that fund to hire, employees beyond the 6-month typical project timeline. And so, that is a good example of why some of these policies need to be updated. The last slide I just had was that the under Title 26, the chapter secretary treasurer had a duty to provide financial reports at those monthly meetings. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. So, okay,